In a moment here, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Helen Berg and Benita Brooks, both from Sam Houston State University. Sam Houston State was the recipient of USPREP's innovation pilot 2 years ago. And they have been going through a 1.5-year process of looking at culturally responsive teaching and creating out a set of modules and webinars in order to share back with the coalition based on their learnings, both within their institution and based on their work nationwide. From the School of Teaching and Learning at Sam Houston State University, and as you know, they are a cohort 2 coalition provider, and so we're really excited to have them. Wanted to let you know that we will be recording. In fact, I'm already recording, and so I wanted to make sure that you all were aware of that. Throughout today's session, we're going to be using a task card, and I'm going to go ahead actually and include that in the chat right now. If you're unfamiliar with what a task card is, at USPREP, I think it was Nicole Lavini actually who started this process, but we've been using and leveraging these task cards because they provide us with an opportunity to kind of stay focused and stay on task, and it kind of alleviates some of the pressure of trying to figure out which link is where and what I need to be doing when in order to fully engage in online learning. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Benita Brooks and Dr. Helen Berg, who will tell you a little bit about what we're going to focus on today. Helen, Benita.
All right, Helen.
Hi, well, good morning, everybody. We are so glad to see so many familiar faces and just everybody here taking a little bit of your time to join us in this webinar. We are really excited to be presenting to you all today. Like Calvin said, this is the 3rd webinar that we are going to be conducting. It has been an amazing journey for us from the beginning in 2017 that we started the work on CRT, and now where we are in our 3rd webinar and just presenting some of the finding and work that we have done around this topic. Really, the work primarily was done developing professional development with our mentor teachers and teacher candidates in the year-long residency. And from that work, we have mirrored the webinars to expand on that. So just to review a little bit, first before we review, I just wanted to say I'm Helen Berg. I'm the Associate Chair for the School of Teaching and Learning. And with me is my colleague, Benita Brooks. And do you want to introduce yourself, Benita?
Sure. I am Dr. Benita Brooks. I'm an associate professor in the School of Teaching and Learning, and I am also the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the College of Education.
Thank you. We just started talking and I forgot to introduce ourselves. But anyway, it just seems so familiar since we've been with a lot of these familiar faces for the 3rd time, and I'm just so excited. It feels like just the community of learners that we have been in this work. So anyway, just to review for those that are new to the webinars, the first webinar, really, we started by defining cultural competence and the work of CRT, but really with the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We really spent some time defining those terms, really creating a foundation for what was to come. We examined ourselves through some work with the cultural x-ray and Where I Am From poem as well. So we really looked at ourselves during that first webinar. The second webinar really focused on the classroom. So we went from the self to the classroom and some work around like a school audit. And we also looked at the classroom library. We did analysis of classroom books and spent some time around those topics. And today, the objectives of today really now go into assessment. So today we would
Sorry about that, y'all. Give me 1 second, I'll get us back on.
It's okay, but I can continue. Well, the objectives of today, it's really for the participants to examine what culturally responsive assessment is and is not. What do we mean by that? We also would like to explore different processes for promoting cultural validity in assessment. Then we will talk a little bit more about some barriers and challenges in regards to equity in assessment. And to finalize, we would really like us to spend some time reflecting on what might be some actionable steps that we can take within our college, department, program, and or school. I know we have a variety of stakeholders here with us today. So as we move in the webinar, please make it the information that we're presenting applicable to your context. That being the college, the department, a program area, a school, depending your context, we're going to be trying to make it conducive to all different environments. Okay. The next one. So to get us started, let's think a little bit about in terms of assessment of student learning. The field really has been largely quiet when it comes to issues of equity. Today, because we're discussing assessment, if not done with equity in mind, privileges and validates certain types of learning and evidence of learning over others, can hinder the validation of multiple means of demonstration, and can reinforce within students the false notion that they do not belong in higher education. To be honest, for equity gaps to be addressed, an entire institution needs to explore the combination of solutions and supports needed for students to be successful. And one of those is truly looking at assessment. So today, we are going to be diving into the topic of assessment. Next.
All right, so now our first question is, so why use culture and not diversity with the term assessment? And so what we already know is that higher education has a tendency to group student differences and issues around race under the term diversity, which is often discussed in relation to benefits to white students as opposed to African Americans, Latinx, Asian Americans, and Native Americans, who continue to be in underrepresented groups in higher education. And so what I want you to do is focus on the underlying sentence. The term diversity fails to address issues surrounding race, ethnicity, and does not account for the different histories, needs, interests, and issues affecting distinct groups of students on campus. And so what I would like to do is give you an example of what this means. A few weeks ago, I reviewed the data results from a climate survey that was conducted on our campus. And as I was reading the results, what I noticed, there were 20% African American or Black students who responded, 30% Hispanic, Latinx, Chicano students who responded, 4% Asian American, and 3% Native American, Alaskan American students who responded to this climate survey. But when it got to the category of actually looking at how they responded to the questions in the survey, what I noticed was that all of the students from the underrepresented group were lumped into one category. So instead of disaggregating the data, they were just lumped into the one category, and the results were 68% white students who felt that they mostly or strongly mattered in classes taught by white professors, and 54% students of color who felt they mostly or strongly matter in classes taught by white professors. So reading those results, it just really confirms what I just read in the slide here, how higher education has a tendency to group student differences and issues around race under the term diversity. And what that does, it really silences the histories, needs, and interests of students from underrepresented groups. Next. And so as we continue to look at the question, why use culture and not diversity with assessment? We want you to think about culture from these specific terms. So culture should be thought of as one, the explicit elements that make people identifiable to a specific group, which can include their behaviors, practices, customs, roles, attitudes, and so forth. Two, the implicit elements that combine a group of people, which include their beliefs, values, ethics, gender identity. So collectively thinking about the different social identity categories. And then three, cognitive elements, or the ways that the lived experiences of a group of people affect their acquisition of knowledge, behavior, cognition, communication, expression of knowledge, and so forth. So as we are thinking about culture and not diversity when it comes to assessment, we want you to think about Kimberly Crenshaw's term intersectionality, because with intersectionality, it allows you to see how the different social identities and lived experiences intertwine.
I apologize, y'all. My mouse has a mind of its own today.
Okay. All right. So then why use culture and not diversity with assessment? The culturally relevant component is mindful of student differences and employs assessment methods appropriate for different student groups. Underlying the culturally relevant component is the focus on students. And so as we go throughout this process, what we want you to do is think about these 5 components. So what is culturally responsive assessment? Culturally responsive assessment is 1, yes, Rochelle, we will be sharing the presentation. So culturally responsive assessment is 1, it gives students a voice. And so what we're asking you to do is to be mindful of your student population, especially those who are historically silenced in your school. 2, uses appropriate student focus and cultural language in statements of learning outcomes. 3, ensures intentional improvement of student learning through disaggregated data-driven change. And I mentioned disaggregated data previously. And so what we want you to do is think about it from this perspective. Simply examining disaggregate data without examining if the assessment process is equitable will lead to continued inequities. So we must also think about the process, if the process of the assessment is equitable as well. And so 4 contains context-specific approaches and responses, and 5 requires educators to be critical, reflective, and inquisitive. And we're going to show you examples of these in just a few. All right, so now let's take a look inside a faculty member's classroom. And so I just read the 5 components of culturally responsive assessment. And so what we would like for you to do is think about those 5 components as I read this particular case study. And let's think about if this professor actually implements those into her classroom. So the questions we want you to ponder are, what culturally responsive assessments did the faculty member use? And in what ways does this faculty member's equity talk align with her equity walk? So on the first day of class, a faculty member asked students to fill out the About You questionnaire, which allows her to get to know her student and to draft assessment methods accordingly. And just to let you know, this particular questionnaire is available in your task card. For instance, A, if some students do not have a computer, she allows handwritten submissions. B, if some students do not have a printer, she allows a digital submissions. C, if some students have dyslexia, she allows submissions via audio recording. D, if some students deal with anxiety disorders, she replaces whole class presentations with group work. E, if some students are veterans with medical and readjusting changes, she views behavior that may seem otherwise antisocial as a response to easily triggered migraines and physical pain. F, if some students are not native English speakers, she slows down and interprets roadblocks from a cultural lens. And G, if students take the bus, she ensures to open her classroom door ahead of time so that they're not waiting in the hallway, and to end class on time so they do not miss their public transportation. And so as a group, we would like for you can post in the chat your responses to the questions, or you can share aloud. What culturally responsive assessments did this faculty member use? And in what ways does her equity talk align with her equity walk? So I see Crystal posted options to meet student needs. Rachel, variety of ways to meet student needs. Yes, Lisa, understanding students have different access to resources and accommodating those fairly. Is there anyone who wants to share aloud, to unmute your mic and share your thoughts aloud? Yes, Sarah, yes, the options show she's doing the equity walk.
Hi, Benita, this is Rochelle.
Hi, Rochelle.
I just wanted to say too that like when one of the things I put in the chat was the variety of ways that you can literally see the different types of students. You know, you talked a while ago about, you know, seeing each individual type student, and you see that as evidence in the different ways she's made adjustments to meet those different students' needs. Like she didn't group them all together.
Yes,
She has an individualized like approach.
she does. Tiffany. Yes. And so what we see here is that before this particular faculty member began creating assessments, learning outcomes, what she did, she got to know her students first. And if you notice from all the webinars that we've conducted for USPREP, we've continuously highlighted the need to get to know your students. And if you have a chance to take a look at the questionnaire, at Heartline's questionnaire, you see that it really does hone in on getting to know the student and ensuring that whatever the student's needs are, that you are ensuring that you are meeting them equitably. You see any other thoughts? Yes, Olga. She's evidently comfortable doing the equity walk. Thank you all for posting your responses. Where can I find the questionnaire? Andrea, it should be in the, available in the task card. And Calvin just posted the link to the task card. Okay. All right, so now that you see an example of what culturally responsive assessment looks like, now we're going to have you move into a breakout group activity 1, in which Helen will explain to you what we would like for you to do.
Benita, can I make a comment?
Yes.
Yes, Jacob.
So I'm sorry, I'm not on video because I'm about to take the dog out. I have a question to ponder. So some of the means of access to knowledge, meaning digital, folks who are taking the bus, et cetera, allowing the classroom to be open earlier, folks who may have dyslexia, other ways of presenting their data. Some people would say some of these are very clearly cultural categories or variables, but others might say they are economic and social. How do you distinguish the difference between what might be identity, culture, and matters of circumstances? So today I'm taking the bus, but next week I'm driving. And so how do we make that difference in terms of culture with those type of variables?
You know what, Jacob, that is a good question. And the way I would see, you would need to make the distinguishment between if it's culture or if it's something else. Is once again, it's getting to know the individual, and it's engaging in conversation with that individual. Because like you gave the example, one week the student might be taking the bus, but then the next week the student could be driving her or his vehicle. And so I think just actually engaging in conversation with the student, understanding, where the student is, that's the best way to determine if it's socioeconomics or if it's cultural.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay. So let's move on into an activity that we would like for you all to do in your groups. And before we go to the breakout rooms, let me explain what we would want for you all to engage in. We have a section of a questionnaire that is on the task card. And the questionnaire is a little bit lengthier than what we showed here on the slide. It's actually 3 pages long, or about 2.5, depending how you put it, 2 pages. And really, this is a culturally responsive assessment. And okay. In the left-hand side, there it is. Thank you, Calvin. You see, it's a little bit longer than that, but we really would like for you to focus just on the category that says assessment and accountability, just to engage in some dialogue and some activity with your colleagues. On my left-hand side is it says current status, and under that current status you see 1 through 5. 1 is not awareness. 2 is know enough but not used. 3 would be good awareness, beginning to use. Frequently in use, not universal. And 5 is well established school-wide. And what we mean by this is that if you think about those 4 categories or rating scales, and then let's look at number 1 under assessment and accountability. So we did this activity with our mentor teachers and our teacher candidates around data that we gather or they get, right? A lot of our teachers get a lot of data about their students or about their school, but what is it that they are doing with this data? Let's look at this data from a different perspective, from a culturally responsive perspective. So we're asking them to rate themselves in terms of their awareness, again, in the various categories. So number 1 says varied assessment methods are used to assess student learning. And they had to rate themselves. Do they know of, but they don't use it? How, are they're pretty much aware of the data and that they're getting and the assessment that they're doing, and they're just starting to use that in a different way or not? So number 2, for example, says assessment data is disaggregated by race, ethnicity, language, and IEP status. Again, depending if you're in a university, you might get different types of data, not exactly IEP status, but you definitely get data in regards to disaggregated. I don't know how you're getting the data. So if you're getting it in terms of if it's disaggregated or not, this is where your current status. And then where do you think it would fall in terms of priority of improvement? So in your breakout rooms, we would like to first rate yourselves in your current status, and then as a collective group, maybe discuss a little bit about what type of data you get. Are you informed in the type of data that's given to you? What are you doing with that data that is given to you? And if it's something that is well established within your school or not. So just engaging in that conversation in your small groups, I think would be very beneficial. So here in a couple minutes, Calvin, before we move, do I have any questions before we go to groups? Yes.
Yeah, there's a question from Rochelle Wooten from Fort Bend ISD, who's asking who completes this assessment. Oh, and Benita already got it.
Oh.
Teachers, faculty, K-12 administration, and university administration.
Yes.
Would you like me to move everyone to breakout groups, Helen?
Yes, I was just wondering if they had any other question before they have, I think we said 10 minutes. I can't remember.
We said 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay.
We just want to make sure everyone is clear on what they're supposed to do in the breakout group. Is everyone clear?
Can you
Again, the key-
retype the questions that Helen went over for us to discuss in the breakout groups?
Yep, it's actually, if you look inside of the task card, and if I
Oh,
could.
it's on there? Got
Yep,
it, sorry.
if you look in row 2,
Yeah, I'm good.
responsive
Yeah.
assessment, it's got each of the steps.
Yes. It's just it's a bigger survey, but I think if we can just focus for this purpose on the assessment and accountability section of it would be great. But we wanted everybody to have the entire survey. Hi, I'm glad everybody's coming back. We had, selfishly, I'm just going to say we had an amazing conversation in my group. So I don't know if anybody in my group would like to share, and I'm just putting everybody in the spot. I know there was Marcella or Ruth or Lori. I don't know if any of you would be happy to just share at least a little bit of.
I'll make a short. We discussed how we can move further in being much more intentional in doing some studies of our candidates in terms of, and then as was brought up in the conversation, in terms of our candidates, who they are, demographically, culturally, racially, et cetera. And again, the patterns in their retention, in their, even their retention in the field later and so on. We need to do some intentional studies on that level, even though we have disaggregated data in some other ways. At our higher.
Thank you, Marcella. Any other group that would like to share out?
Someone from my group? I think we had a rich conversation also. No one? Keandra, Holly? I'm doing the same thing as Helen, just calling people out.
We did have a really good conversation, and we really focused in on the disconnect of discourse that happens between sometimes the K-12 students or even the students that show up as teacher candidates, of really being able to be prepared for the high stakes testing and the ability to really hold faculty members accountable for the content of the high stakes testing. There was conversation that there may be some people that disagree with the philosophy of testing and therefore are not as connected to really making sure that all students are prepared for the high stakes testing. While that may be true, but there's still a responsibility to make sure that all students are prepared, because that can be some barriers for students being able to access different parts of their career. So we did spend a bit of conversation just talking about the discord and the disconnect that sometimes is present.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other group?
Lisa, I see you said we discussed this a bit as well. Would you like to share?
Sure. Let me put my camera on. I think what we ended up discussing in our group was more about our different contexts. Because one of our members was in New Hampshire, another one was in New York. I'm in Vallejo, California. Very different contexts. Because in one case, predominantly white context and how do you do this work in a predominantly white environment. And then for me in Vallejo, California, we're one of the most diverse cities in the nation. And so we actually have the opposite issue where we have lots of Black and brown kids in our public schools, but a lot of our teachers are actually white, although we're slowly shifting those demographics through some innovative work. So we talked about that, but I just brought up, because I'll be honest, I think we all kind of said we have a lot of work to do from a university standpoint, that we're all embarking on the work, but there's still a way to go. And that, the only example I could think of is where the high stakes testing is what we've made some progress on in supporting our teacher candidates. But we did look at the disaggregated data by race on like our CBEST scores and CSET. And we found it was actually more about economics than it was about race when we looked at the data, because teachers that had to work while they were going through their teacher candidate programs struggled with the test. And really it was I think it's the time balance, and the concentration, which is an equity issue. So anyway, anyone else in my group?
I think that testing issue, we didn't talk a lot about it, and I was in Lisa's group also, but it's fascinating, and it just listening to you talk about it now, Clondra, I think it was you, the people who I work with who talk the biggest game in culturally responsive teaching and assessment are also the people who despise the standardized testing and so refuse to dedicate classroom time to those goals, right? To helping students pass the test because they disapprove personally, like they disagree with the test as a valid assessment measure. And so it's very interesting, right? Like if we're actually talking about equity and inclusion, we have to prepare people for those tests. They have to get through those tests or they won't be public school teachers. So, yeah, so that juxtaposition is really interesting to me. I appreciate hearing it from you guys.
Patrick is asking, let me see.
I was going to say, Benita, Mary.
Some of the comments, let me see. Patrick, would you like to chime in? And Mary Alice? Can you all hear me? Okay. So, well, I'll read. So Patrick, let me see, raised an interesting point. He says, the role of standardized tests of teacher candidates as a requirement for licensure is a significant barrier to increasing diversity of the teacher corps. This is a major issue for candidates coming from limited English backgrounds and coming from other countries.
Yeah, this is Pat.
That's very true.
It's Pat Burke. I'm at Portland State.
There you are, Patrick. Hi, Patrick. I remember you.
Yeah. I'm at Portland State, and I teach primarily in the not primarily. I teach in the administration program. So my experience is anecdotal. Some of my teacher prep colleagues are online. They might want to chime in, but as a department, what we are seeing is that even as students are completing teacher preparation, students for whom English is not their primary language really struggle with the state requirements for evidence for licensure. And a lot of that is driven by standardized processes. The state of Oregon does require a portfolio of evidence, and the portfolio of evidence is more accessible in my view, and in some ways more important in looking at the capacity of somebody to teach effectively in a diverse classroom. But this issue of standardized testing of teachers is a stumbling block.
So basically what you're saying is the state of Oregon allows teacher candidates to submit a portfolio instead of taking the standardized test.
It's a combination of both, and it's something that has been evolving over the last several years. And there's certainly a desire to make the assessment process more fair and more equitable. On the other hand, there's political pressure from the legislature and others that say, look, we don't want to put people in classrooms who are not well prepared, and we want documentation that they are well prepared. So it's a debate in the state about how to determine that someone is adequately prepared to be a teacher in the state. Of course, part of the issue with portfolio or the advantage of portfolio work is that it's based on actual teacher performance, not a standardized test, which measures a whole variety of things, but might not be measuring capacity to be effective in the classroom. So we're looking for ways to make sure, and we have the same issue with administrators in my department. What are we collecting data? Yes. Are we collecting the right data that tells us that people are effective in the role? That's a different question.
Because I would like to know more about in the future, you know, those teachers, those teacher candidates who graduate from your institution, once they get into the classroom, looking at how those who submitted a portfolio, looking at their teaching performance versus those who actually took the standardized test. What are some differences that you see in their pedagogy?
Boy, you have your finger, Benita, on a hugely important issue to us. I agree with you 100%. We are having difficulty in the state system developing a manageable process to track employment post-license and post-graduation. The state does not have a very robust data management system that would let us track our candidates once they are in the workforce. We are very interested in our administrative work, for example, of looking at our graduates 5 years out. So one of the issues we struggle with is, after 5 years, do we even know if our graduates are working administrators? That's a hard question to answer. Second question is, if they are working, where are they working? That's a hard question to answer. And then the third question is, do we have any way of getting in touch with them? So we've been, this whole issue of postgraduate placement and success is very important in assessing our program, but it's a struggle to get the data.
Yeah, we are fortunate in Texas to have some of that data through CREATE, which is an organization that produces some of the data on retention of our graduates in comparison to other universities. And
is that a private company?
It's a public. Are you familiar with it, Calvin? It's a public, yep. The CREATE.
It's actually housed at the University of Houston. So,
okay.
Yep.
Okay.
It's a center that lives within the University of Houston.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Appreciate the tip. It's called CREATE, is that right?
Yep.
And maybe we can share out some of that data. We could have, anyway, yes. They have really interesting data in there. And I know we want to be cognizant of time, but thank you everybody for sharing. I know there's much discussion to continue. I think we need a whole session just on testing, but just to move us along, Benita, do we want to continue? There we go. Okay.
And so we asked the question earlier, and so we will return to it. So what is culturally responsive assessment? And so we want to continue to be cognizant of the fact that a culturally responsive assessment gives students a voice. It uses appropriate student focus and cultural language in statements of learning outcomes. It ensures intentional improvement of student learning through disaggregated data. It contains specific context-specific approaches and responses, and it includes criticality and reflexivity. So now what we have for you are some elements of a process for promoting cultural validity in assessment. And so I would recommend this actual article reference is available to you on your task card. And it's an article by Trumbull and Nelson Barber. And it's the ongoing quest for culturally responsive assessment for Indigenous students in the US. And I think it's a very important article that all of you should read whenever you get a chance. So that's where we get this particular template from. So as we start thinking about how to promote cultural validity and assessment, we want to consider the following activities that are listed here. And these are good activities to use to engage in criticality and reflexivity. For you as faculty, or for you as administration, for teachers, for anyone that's dealing with students in K through 12 or higher education. So let's look at the first activity. The first activity, it says phase is identification of assessment content. So a simple question that you might want to ask is, what content should be assessed, or does it match what has been taught? So if we're talking moving from equity talk to equity walk, these questions allow you to reach that equity walk phase. And so decisions about the language or language variety to be used for the assessment. So what language or languages and language variety or varieties is or most often used for instruction? What language or language variety or students are students most familiar with? And how can assessment questions be phrased most clearly, avoiding unnecessarily complex grammar and unfamiliar vocabulary that is not germane to the content? And in our breakout group previously, we talked about James G, lowercase d and capital D discourse. And so the lowercase d, that's the language students bring into the classroom from their home. And the capital D is typically the academic discourse. So what language or languages are you using to engage in instruction? So choice of assessment format or modality can force choice, force comparison, or true false items which have been shown to penalize native students and English language learners be avoided? And would a collaborative peer assessment be appropriate? What have teachers observed to work well? Decisions about when and how to administer the assessment. Is it to be on demand, or do students have a choice about when to be assessed? Is it timed? Is it framed as a competition? Setting guidelines for scoring. What criteria will be used to judge student performance? Will non-standard language or spelling count against the student? Should only a Western writing style be given high marks? Interpretation of scores. How did students interact with the assessment? How did students interact with the assessment? Were they engaged? What does a low score mean? Is a total score meaningful when there is variability in performance on questions or activities assessing similar concepts? And use assessment information. Will assessment scores or other outcomes be used for purposes of grading, program placement, graduation, etc.? Is this a fair use of the information garnered? And I think going through this process will allow us to, begin to achieve that equity that we're looking for when it comes to assessment. And many of you are living in places where it's very diverse populations, where there are tons of students where English is not their first language. And so I think this is a good tool for you to use to really start ensuring that we are reaching those students. And so what we would like for you to do now, the next slide. We want you to review the cultural validity and assessment, what I just went over with you. And we would like for you to, in your breakout groups, to answer. You don't necessarily have to answer all of the questions. What we would like for you to do is pick one of the questions and engage in conversation in your breakout room using the cultural validity and assessment tool that I just reviewed with you.
I just want to make note that on the task card, which if I could invite one of my team members to throw that back into the chat again, just in case you lost that link, we're currently on this fourth row right here, and you'll see the 4 questions that Benita just referenced in the 4th row, in case you need to look at them as you get into your small groups. with that, Benita and Helen, would you all like to have me open up the breakout rooms?
Yes, yes, and we have 15 minutes. Well, we might have 10 minutes, 10 minutes. Is that better, Cameron?
Okay, 10 minutes. All right, I'm gonna open the rooms now. Jessica, Ruth, or Ina, do y'all need any assistance?
Oops.
Okay, Helen and Benita, you should have everyone back.
Okay.
Okay. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but do we have one or two individuals that would be willing to share from their groups?
So in my group, one of the questions that came up based on an observation of a colleague was, and we didn't get an opportunity to discuss, was whatever tools we're using, assessment tools we're using to with teacher candidates, what opportunities, or if there are opportunities for calibration within the faculty, because the example that I used was at the scene of the crime, you can have 4 witnesses and all 4 witnesses saw something different. So that if we're able to have opportunities to calibrate how we use our tools with each other, we all can, I guess, get to the place where we say, how good is good enough?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Annabelle. I agree. What are we doing to ensure that we have time to discuss and calibrate among us as faculty? Mm-hmm.
Helen, I would share too, just on behalf of my group, one thing that we talked about is there's 4 of us in our group, and we all agreed, right, with what we were seeing in particular in this. We kind of focused in on the table and the sample questions and talked a lot about that. And then we started to talk about the field is doing this. So in higher education, we can be teaching our teacher candidates to do this. And then in the K-12 world, we can be ensuring that the teachers that are going out into the field know how to do this. And then the responsibility that we were saying as a coalition, as 50 people on this call, to continue to realize we have to influence policy a little bit, right? So we can do all of this in the classroom and we can do all of this at higher ed, but if our students are still being forced into a standardized test that is going to be using language that is not equitable to them, or question structures that are not equitable, we're still setting them up for failure in that area or in that arena. So we had a really interesting conversation too about there's a lot of power in just this call right here. And how do we use that power in a time where it may be a really good time for us to, because of, we're seeing some universities say they're not going to focus in on SAT scores, or they're not going to focus in on some of these standardized scores that follow this template. So our group really kind of dug into that.
I agree with you, Sarah, that we are a very powerful group here. That I know Lisa was even posting earlier on that she has, I think it was a group in her area that is working in some, a bigger policy, more type initiatives. But I mean, I agree. I mean, I think there needs to be more to be said. And I think maybe just even a different space where we can have conversation as educators come together to actually even have a statement that comes forward, or I mean, I'm just, brainstorming here with you all, but, absolutely, I agree. These are topics that we do need to engage in. And I mean, this is the first step. I mean, coming together and really tackling them and, putting them out there in the open and saying, okay, here we go. Let's talk about it.
And I think, sorry, this is Lisa. I just wanted to add
there. Yes.
really quick. I think that a lot of like larger national organizations like AERA, AACTE, USPREP, those are the spaces to kind of push this national argument around education. And now, of course, we have a new administration. So hopefully we'll see, sorry, I don't want to talk politics, but hopefully we'll see maybe some changes around this particular issue and topic. And I know that, I mentioned Care Ed because I just joined Care Ed, by the way, so I'm not an expert on there, but we're getting really active on policy changes in the state of California around anything to do with K-12 education. And we have out-of-state members. So if you're interested, feel free to join us, but we're doing the actual work. Like, how do we get the work? And that's why I actually put it, because one of my jobs is to help other groups connect with Care Ed and what's happening in California to help with this, with the national picture.
And
local picture.
Thank you, Lisa. We have a quote coming up that I think it's really relevant to the conversation we're having right now, but I do want to not leave anybody out that wanted to share back to the larger group. Okay, so if we can move forward, I think this really brings it back to our final quote. And I know, Benita, you're going to be on with this one, but it really, I think it just summarizes a little bit of the conversation that we were having. Go ahead. I don't want to go, Benita.
Equity work is not someone else's responsibility. We each play a role in equity-minded assessment. There are elements we control within our spheres of work and influence, which can alleviate the mechanisms through which inequities exist and persist. So Sarah, I was just thinking about your comment, and it's so true. We prepare our students, but then they go to the workforce and it's a different environment. But it's still their responsibility within their classroom, what they can control, and to ensure that they are equity minded. And so our job is to ensure that we prepare them for their classroom, even if they do work for an administration that might contradict what their beliefs are. Because I know that can be a struggle. I was a classroom teacher for years, so I know too. But it's still their job to ensure that they are equity minded in what they do.
And I do think it's critical to think that we each play a role in this context. And as long as we continue to play our role, we will be fighting the inequities that exist. Yes. So I didn't want to, but yes, I agree. So the next slide is, and I know we're coming to the end of our presentation, but we really wanted you all to take a couple minutes and think about, how do you see yourself now that you know a little bit more about CRT? Again, this has been a 3-pronged webinar. This is our 3rd webinar. And we just wanted to see if you don't mind just taking just a couple seconds to write something in the chat in regards to the time that we have spent together. And then we were going to leave you with one more resource.
And as you're kind of answering that question and how you see yourself, a great place to capture that is the feedback survey link. We have a question that actually directly relates to this, or you can feel free to memorialize that. Would love to hear your thoughts. And at the same time, complete the feedback survey, which I've included in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And while people are just writing a few comments down, If you go to the next slide, please. We wanted to present one more resource. And again, we cannot forget that we are in a global pandemic and that during this time of crisis, a lot of things have shifted in the work that we do as educators. And we wanted to make sure that we are sensitive and to capture that this moment that we're living today. And that being said, I mean, we're all here in Zoom instead of a wonderful convening or somewhere else. But this resource really is a questionnaire that the National Institute for Learning Outcomes assessment put together in response to the global pandemic. And they did a survey with faculty that because we had to move everything so dramatically to online and how we have responded to our students, this is just a summary of do's and don'ts in terms of assessment and higher ed. And just, it really is a nice report of spring, fall and spring semesters, and in terms of what faculty had done in terms of their assessments, how we have responded as institutions of higher ed. And really it gives you a little bit of advice on what things to keep and what we have learned from this pandemic and our COVID world and what not to. So we wanted to leave you with a little bit of an extra resource in terms of the reality, unfortunately, that we're living in, but also the learnings that we've gathered through it. So I know the resource is available through your task card. So at a later time, you can read through it. And I think it has some valuable information as well in there. So with that said, we have 2-3 minutes left. And we just want to thank you all for being here with us. I know the slides will be available. We have truly enjoyed our 3 webinars. Benita, I don't know if any
I'm just responding to the messages in the chat. But thank you all once again for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. We hope this 3 series of webinars have been helpful. And I included our email addresses in the chat. So please feel free to stay in touch with us, to reach out, ask questions, because we're more than happy to be a part of this journey so that our equity talk can match our equity walk.
And if you have a moment, please be sure to take the survey. We'd love your feedback. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Have a great rest of the day.
Yes. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.